This is the Mahabharata Podcast, Episode 4, Shakuntala and King Bharata. Some of you who are familiar with the Mahabharata may be wondering when I was going to get to the famous story of Vyasa sitting with the elephant god Ganesha and narrating the story of the epic. It is a wonderful scene, in which Ganesha offers to transcribe the tale as fast as Vyasa can narrate it. The elephant-headed god breaks off the tip of his tusk and uses it as a writing implement. Thus, even today, when you see statues of the elephant-headed god, you'll notice that the tip of one of his tusks is missing. This was Lord Ganesha's contribution to the composition of the Mahabharata. Unfortunately, all of this is considered spurious and has been expunged from the scholarly, critical edition of the Mahabharata. What this means for us in this podcast is that I will be relying on the critical edition for most of this story. This version was compiled by scholars in the 20th century who compared all the different versions of the Mahabharata and created a unified critical edition. There are not many translations of the entire epic, so I depend mostly on a translation of this critical edition. A second translation I have available is one by Kesari Mohan Ganguly. Ganguly translated a version of the Mahabharata based on the well-known Bombay recension, but this was done in the 19th century, and the language is especially difficult to follow. Ganguly's version does mention Ganesha briefly, but even that version does not include all the details that most people are familiar with. Going forward, I will rely mostly on the critical edition, but I will occasionally refer to Ganguly and even other Puranas for some contrast or more details. Getting back to the story, I have to admit that at this point the narrative gets a little disjointed. Book 7 begins with a series of genealogies and then provides a brief essay called The Partial Incarnations. We'll hear more about this legendary conflict in later stories, but in this instance, they tell us of a great battle between the gods and the Asuras in the spirit realm. Following the defeat of the Asuras, these demonic beings came to incarnate in great numbers on the earth. The tyranny and violence of these fallen angels was a great burden to the earth, and the Earth Mother herself appealed to the great god Brahma. Upon hearing her appeal, God Brahma gave orders to all the gods. You must each incarnate a part of yourselves on earth to help relieve her burden. All the gods from Indra down took the word of their creator to heart. Impatient to go to earth and be reborn with portions of themselves, they went to Vishnu. They asked him to descend with a part of himself, and he replied, "So shall it be." So now we know the bad guys in our story are not just some perverse princelings, and the eventual annihilation of the warrior caste is not a meaningless slaughter. Finally, we get a peek at how Vishnu decided to come to Earth and incarnate as Krishna. The book then proceeds to identify nearly every character in the story, however obscure, as the incarnation of some divine Asura, Danava, or god. Since we hear again, later in the story, about the divine origins of the main characters, there's no need for me to go into it right now, so we'll skip ahead. What follows next is the story of Shakuntala and Bharata. This tale begins with the great king Dushanta. Ruling during a veritable golden age, he was one of those perfect kings, a mighty warrior ruling over a happy populace. While off on some combination of military campaign and hunt, he devastates a few forests, killing all the animals as he goes along, and then moves on to find a new forest to desecrate. Upon entering this forest, King Dushanta came across an enchanted grove inhabited by holy men. He saw a hermitage that mirrored the world of Brahma, echoing with the humming of bees and swarming of birds. He heard the hymns of the Rig Veda being chanted, as rituals were spun out by the foremost of Brahmins. Everywhere he saw grand and perfected ascetics, strict in their vows, engaged in the muttering of spells and the offering of oblations. And thus the king, with his counselor and priest, entered Kanva's sanctum. King Dushanta dismissed his retinue and entered the compound alone. He called out for Kanva and got no reply. Hearing his call, a beautiful young maiden appeared, dressed as a female hermit. She offered him hospitality and gave him a seat and washed his feet and asked what she could do for him. The king checked her out, admired her flawless body, and then asked to see Kanva. She told him that her father Kanva had gone to gather fruit. The lascivious king admired her body some more and then asked her, "Who are you? Whose are you? Why, fair-waisted girl, have you come to this wilderness? I want to know all about you. Please tell me, my pretty." She laughed and said, "I'm regarded as the daughter of the venerable Kanva." This surprised King Dushanta, and he pointed out that the saintly Kanva wasn't the sort to mess around and have children. The girl, Shakuntala, replied with the story of how she was born and came to be adopted by holy Kanva. Before I go into this story, I should first point out how deep the layers can get in the Mahabharata. At this point, we're hearing a story told by Shakuntala, which was told by Vaisampayana, which was told by Ugrashravas. That's 3 layers of narrative, and it goes one deeper from here, because Shakuntala tells the story as she heard it from Kanva. This sort of recursive narrative style is sometimes confusing, but we might as well get used to it, because a lot of interesting stories in the book are presented this way. So, back to the story of Shakuntala's birth and adoption. This one begins with yet another king, named Vishvamitra. This king gave up everything to pursue religious austerities, and became so powerful that he even earned a promotion from Kshatriya to Brahmin. He was so devoted that he acquired nearly godlike powers, to the extent that he was even able to create entire galaxies. Vishvamitra finally got to the point where the god Indra felt threatened by his power. Indra decided to come up with a way of distracting Vishvamitra and tapping some of his strength. The obvious solution for tempting a long celibate man, of course, would be to send him a lovely temptress. So Indra summoned the beautiful Apsara named Menaka. Menaka, you are distinguished in the divine talents of the Apsaras. Take my welfare to heart and do as I ask. That ascetic Vishvamitra has been performing awesome austerities that make my mind tremble. Menaka, I have assigned Vishvamitra to you as your burden, so go to him and seduce him, lest he topple me from my throne. Make use of your beauty, youth, sweetness, smiles, and flatteries, and turn him away from his austerities. After getting a guarantee of protection from Indra, and a fragrant breeze from the wind god, Menaka set out to tempt Vishvamitra. Thus prepared, the scantily dressed nymph greeted Vishvamitra as he was engaged in some austerity. Meditation. She began to play in front of him, and the wind picked up and blew off her skirt. Naked, she ran to catch it and hugged it to her body. Vishvamitra saw the whole thing, and fell victim to love and lusted to lie with her. He asked her, and she was blamelessly willing. The pair of them whiled away a very long time in the woods, making love when the spirit seized them, and it seemed like only one day. And on Menaka, the hermit begot Shakuntala, on the bank of the river Malini. Once the baby was born, Menaka abandoned the child, and, her duty done, she returned rapidly to Indra's assembly. So, the infant Shakuntala was left alone in the wilderness. The birds of the forest protected her from the wild animals until Kanva came across her and adopted her as his daughter. For now, we hear no more of Vishvamitra. Presumably, Indra's mission was accomplished. Later, we'll hear more of his backstory, how he decided to give up kingship in favor of the religious life. Now back to Shakuntala and King Dushanta. He was delighted to find out this girl was not only available, but also born of a king, making her perfectly qualified to be his wife. He immediately pressed his suit. And very clear it is that you are a daughter of a king, the way you told it. Be my wife, buxom woman. Today all my kingdom will be yours. Be my wife, my pretty. Come to me, timid and lovely, according to the rite of the Gandharvas, because the Gandharva mode is cited as the best of marriage rites. Dushanta then proceeded to explain the 8 types of marriages, ranging from elopement to arranged marriages to abduction. Gandharva marriages were a type of elopement in which the bride chooses the husband for herself. As we'll see later, this mode of marriage, along with simply absconding with the bride and fighting anyone who resists, are considered the very best methods for a true Kshatriya. Shakuntala was no fool, however. She held out and said she would only agree to marry him if he would swear to make the son they conceive his heir to the throne. Without hesitation, the king replied, "So shall it be, and I shall conduct you to my city, just as you deserve. This I swear to you, my lovely." Having thus spoken, the king took his flawless bride by the hand and lay with her. Afterward, he comforted her and departed, saying, "I shall send an escort for you, with footmen, horses, chariots, and elephants, and they shall take you to me at my castle, sweet, smiling Shakuntala." Both Shakuntala and Dushanta worried that they might have angered the old hermit Kanva. It's not safe to upset these powerful old sadhus, but he was all right with the marriage. He agreed that elopement was the best form of marriage for the Kshatriya class and gave him his blessing. So the king returned home and pretty much forgot about his fling in the forest. In the meantime, Shakuntala gave birth to a son. This was, of course, no ordinary son. She was pregnant with him for 3 full years, and when he was born, he was a large child with shining and pointed teeth, solid like a lion, wearing on his palm the sign of the wheel. He was large-headed and strong. When he was 6 years old, the child would fetter lions and tigers to the trees around the hermitage and run about playing and riding and taming them. Watching the boy and his superhuman exploits, Kanva told Shakuntala, "It is time for him to become the crown prince." Kanva said to his students, "Today you must take Shakuntala with her son to her husband, for it is not good for women to live too long with their kinsmen. It imperils their reputation, good conduct, and virtue." So they all headed off to Hastinapur, and Shakuntala presented the boy to King Dushanta. Before the king's court, Shakuntala introduced the boy and announced, "This is your son, sire. Consecrate him as your heir, for he is the godlike son you have begotten on me. Now act with him as you promised, greatest of men." But the old king pretended not to recognize her. He squinted his eyes and said, "I don't remember you. Who are you? I don't recall ever having had recourse to you. You can go or stay or do whatever you want." Shakuntala was overcome with shame and anger, but she held her ground. She gave the king a long lecture on Dharma, the importance of keeping one's vows, and of claiming one's children. She reminded him that having a son is the only way to attain salvation. The king responded rudely. He said, "I do not know that this is really my son here, Shakuntala. Women are liars. Who will trust your word? Your own mother was a merciless slut who cast you off on a peak in the Himalayas. Your cruel father, who reached for Brahmanhood, was a lecher. Are you not ashamed to say such incredible things, especially in my presence? Your son is too big, and he's strong even while still a child. How can you have grown so big in such a short time? I don't know you. Get out of here." Shakuntala continued to plead her case at length, but then finally gave up and departed. As she turned to go, a disembodied voice spoke from the sky to Dushanta, and as he sat surrounded by his priests and counselors, it said, "The mother is the father's water sack. He is the father who begets the son. You have planted this child. Shakuntala has spoken the truth. Keep this great-spirited son, for he is yours, and such is our behest. And as you keep him, he will be known by the name of Bharata." Finally, with this divine intervention, the king relented. Thinking himself clever, he explained to his counselors that if he had accepted Shakuntala and Bharata's legitimacy on their word alone, there would always be suspicion that the child was not his. But now that heaven itself had endorsed the boy's legitimacy, he could recognize Bharata as his own. He then forgave Shakuntala for her harsh words. It must be good to be king, because no one asked him why he didn't simply retrieve his wife from the forest like he promised he would. But I guess all's well that ends well. Thus, Bharata inherited the throne and led the kingdom to great conquests. He eventually conquered the known world, and by his fame, his descendants were called the Bharata dynasty. So now we have established the lineage that will bring forth the main characters of our story. Next time, we'll finally get focused on the main storyline, starting with Bharata's heir Shantanu and his sons. Thanks for listening.